Awesome. So yeah, I was just kind of work through the questions I sent you over email. So first thing is just like, what motivated you to get going on this project, and like where were you in your career at the time? What was happening? Yeah.
I will say, even before starting, I was so excited when I got your email because like one, like it gives us a chance to like chat and just like catch up on things. And also because like very selfishly talking about or like our false memory paper and work is probably my favorite of all the topics of things that we've done and studied. Like the false memory stuff is just so near and dear. Um, the like the idea behind the project was like simultaneously twofold. Like one, there's like the academic sciencey version of the motivation behind it, and then there's just like the real life version of how the project came to be. The real life version was like, we're working on like all of these engram experiments, and like we didn't really start off with like a hypothesis about false memories or the hippocampus may be involved with blah blah. Like all of the sciencey stuff was kind of an after the fact like retrofitting of a science narrative. When we started the project, it was really like in a very sincere way. It was like this would be holy crap cool if it worked, and it would tell us a lot about what we can or can't do with artificially manipulating memories. And like it has that kind of like, I don't know, Inception is one of my favorite movies, so it has that like Inception-y vibe to it, where selfishly I was just like, this is awesome, because it's the first time in a project that like I've ever really, really felt like that it's as sci-fi as it could have that it could have gotten. So like that, the fact that it just felt very sci-fi and very like wild and crazy was in and of itself like I don't know, I was enamored by that, because I was just like, I know that not all of science is going to have me googly-eyed and like, this is so cool. But that was definitely the idea of trying to manipulate the contents of a memory was something that it just cut across all of my favorite like Christopher Nolan movies, and it cut across all of like the different ideas of what the warpability of memory means, and can we even model that in rodents and so on. So that was like the genesis of the idea in terms of like the personal narrative. The actual like the day of, I remember the day specifically where Xu and I were in New York in 2011, and we were giving in 2012, and Susumu was invited to give a talk about our recent paper on activating memories. And I remember it's one of the most fond memories that I have, where Xu and I went, and it was like the first time that we've ever really like hung out with Susumu, because we don't really like hang out with Susumu. And Susumu was like, come to the hotel, we'll have like a nice dinner, blah, 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 blah. And yeah, it was at the Ritz-Carlton by Central Park. And I remember walking in there being like, this is the nicest place I will ever be at in my life, so I'm going to savor this as much as possible. So we go to dinner, have a bunch of food and drinks, and we get to like just, I don't know, we talked a lot about like Susumu's past, this and that. And afterwards, he was like, Susumu was like, oh, like you guys go out and have fun, and like I'm going to call it a night. So Xu and I like left dinner like at midnight, and we were, it was like freezing outside in Times Square. And I remember we walked into some random like dive bar, and we were like, let's just keep the night going and just see like where the night takes us. And it was like well past midnight. And I remember we were talking about like, okay, so we like science isn't done. So what are we going to do to follow up our like memory reactivation paper? Cause like we have so many ideas of like Alzheimer's and positive memories, and like all of the different ideas that were ballooning in the field. And we sat down and we were like, okay, let's think through like an idea of, and we started getting into the Inception conversation and false memory conversation. And I had recently read Dan Schachter's like 7 Sins of Memory. And I remember the idea of memory's malleability was still in mind. So Xu and I were like, it was like 1 a.m. and we're at this Irish pub, just like pulling out like napkins with like literally just drawing like box A, the animal gets fear condition, box B, like literally like out of a movie. And like, but I knew that. So in my head, it was very romanticized in the moment. I was just like, this does feel like the part in the movie where they totally get the scientists wrong. And they're like, no one writes on napkins and experimentally pans that way. And yeah, that's what we were doing. And we did the whole like fear condition in A, reactivate the memory in B while they were being blah, blah, blah. And like, and And we came up with like there was a really simple design that we came up with. And then we got back to lab like a few days later and just like sat down with our little engram team. And we were just like, here's an idea that we could do. And given that we knew at that point that the dentate activation stuff was working, we were like, this experiment should actually only take like 3 days. Like, cause we're labeling an environment, we're reactivating that environment separately during fear conditioning, and then testing whether the animals freeze in that environment again, literally 3 days. And within a couple of weeks, we had an answer. And the last part of it is, I remember this also specifically because the day that the false memory experiment worked was December 24th in 2012. And I remember because my parents were outside waiting to pick me up to go to family dinner for Christmas. And they were like, them and I have an older brother, older sister. Everyone in my family was pissed off at me because I was in lab quickly trying to run this experiment because it was only an hour experiment. But I was like, you guys don't understand. I was like, we get to find out whether this works or not this day. And I mean, I could have managed my time a little bit better, admittedly, but I made them wait. I was in lab on the 24th, 1 hour experiment, did it. The animals froze in the neutral environment. And I remember going back to Christmas dinner being like, I sent Xu an email, and I've like written all this down. This is why it's so vivid in memory, but I sent Xu an email with the graph showing that the experiment worked. And it was just, it was inception.pdf. And I sent him it being like, I just sent it to him in all caps being like, Merry freaking Christmas. And then he responded just being like, that's excellent. Like just in his own excited way. And I tried explaining this to my family at Christmas dinner. And that's when I realized like, there's way more to the world than my 4 walls of the hippocampus. Cause everyone was like, what are you talking? CFOS this, dentate that, like, what are you saying? We're just trying to enjoy like ham and mashed potatoes here. So, but anyway, that's the like true Hollywood version, I guess, of like where the experiments began and then the day it worked. And then afterwards it was just the wild, wild west. Cause we didn't, there's no way we could have known how, much that work would resonate with there was no real target audience. The audience there was just everybody, because like everybody has such a intuition for memory, and false memories is so prevalent culturally. And like, I think that's why I love that project the most specifically, because it really seemed to be bigger than just science and hippocampus and engram. It really seemed to be something that is just like, I don't know, that resonated with as large of an audience as possible. And like from the educational perspective, that really meant a lot to be able to reach that many people.
Yeah, totally. That is like way too Hollywood to even feel real. Like the late night Irish pub napkin to Christmas Eve, finishing up the experiment.
It's crazy. Like I oh my God, because I was writing all of this down to that's a side note. I think I mentioned briefly I was like working on like a book that's half memoir, half pop sci, and like
awesome.
And then this was part where I was like, those were the memories that I think of really fondly, because they not only like involved my time with Xu, but also we happened to cook up an experiment that worked, which is not the case like 99% of the times in science. So yeah, it's definitely one that's like near and dear.
Yeah. What made you worry that it wouldn't work? Like, was there something in particular you were thinking would be hard?
I think the hardest part was just that when we activated these cells in the hippocampus, there's no real way of, at the time, of knowing, like, is the animal actually recalling the memory or not? Like from the previous work, we're like, yeah, the animal's freezing, but is it freezing because it's remembering that something bad happened? Or is it freezing because, I don't know, the hippocampus was just tickled in the right way and it freaked the animal out and it's freezing and so on and so forth. So I think the first thing was like, in order for that experiment to work, like, or at least in my opinion, like there had to have been some aspect of that memory that was conjured back online when we stimulated these cells. And maybe now we can like take it for granted a little bit more in the field that it's like just matured so much. But just the idea that like, I don't know, a couple of tens of thousands of cells in the dentate would be enough to get back enough of a memory that could then be updated with something that's happening in real time to the animal, like a foot shock. Like there was just so many reasons why that sounded too like, I don't know, like too unfeasible. Like it's just, it's, I don't know, like there was so many more things that could have either gone wrong in terms of like, is the animal actually experiencing memory or not? And I think that that's another part that I really liked about it, is that the project almost inherently had this like philosophical angle of like, we couldn't avoid speculating what was going on in the mind's eye of the mouse, because we're like, if it's working the way we think it's working, we have to anthropomorphize a little bit and be like, we do think that there is some aspect of a bona fide memory that is coming back online and being updated. But the fact, like, just being able to say that about what a rodent is experiencing is like kind of sacrilegious, and like in a lot of systems neuro, where maybe not so much anymore, but at least like a decade ago, it was definitely something that we were like, it almost certainly won't work because we are probably not activating fully a memory or something like that. So I think that just the idea that we could activate these cells and it would cause this like domino effect of recollection, that was still so conceptually, literally unbelievable, until things keep working and then they slowly become believable.
Yeah. And the thing that really drives that home is that when you like activate a bunch of other cells, you don't get the same effect, right? So that really shows that it's like those cells, that's the memory.
Yeah, exactly. And that was probably one of the most exciting parts for us, was that a lot of the field was beginning, or has converged on the idea that there's some aspect of, like in the hippocampus at least, that some contextual aspect of the memory is coming back online when we activate these cells. Why, we don't know, but just that it works was like, I think really the conceptual milestone there. And I think like another reason we were worried was that Xu and I were definitely perfectionists when it, well, actually I would say Xu was the perfectionist. I was the like more chaotic, like I just was like a bubble of like, I don't know, I was early in grad school, so I was like a bubble of like wide-eyed well, I still think I'm a cup is 3/4 full person, but I was just very like wide-eyed, optimistic, everything's awesome, blah 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 kind of approach. And like and then Xu was the more measured, like, you know, we got to do controls, we got to repeat it, we got to replicate it, blah blah blah. But because of that, I defaulted a little bit more to being like, okay, he's right, and I need to be a little bit more careful in how I do experiments and meticulous. But I think that Susumu noticed that Xu and I, in a sense, were getting in our own way, because even before we started our first engram reactivation experiments, we were like, all right, here's the controls, let's pilot this out, let's test blah, does the virus leak, whatever. Until Susumu kind of cornered us one day and was like, you guys just got to do the main experiment, like just activate these cells and see what happens. Nothing happens, then you can figure it out. Was it because it was leaky, because the animals were doing weird things, whatever. And that was the big push that we needed, was like we needed someone to kind of put on a brave face for us to actually push us to do the actual experiment. And then I think that was because we were both very like in the weeds of thinking of all the ways that things wouldn't work, which I think is just like, that's just practicing science, but almost to a fault, until we kind of got the momentum push. And then the first like reactivation experiments were working. And then when the false memory stuff began working, that's when the engram team in the lab was really growing. And I honestly think that when the false memory stuff started working, I think that is when we really had this like, oh damn moment of like this, there is like there is at least a career's worth of experiments to be done to just try to figure out this little corner of the dentate in memory, let alone the rest of the brain and engram in the works. And I think that that's when we were like particularly wowed by it, because if not, we were kind of like, it was hard to see the forest for the trees when we were like in it in the moment. Maybe the second wow thing, just anecdotally, was at that time, Tomas Ryan had just joined the lab and he wanted to do work on amnesia and engrams. And he was the first person in the lab to replicate both our reactivation experiments and false memory experiments. So seeing someone else replicate it, and Tomas, he was such a stickler about it too. He was like, he did the experiment and he wouldn't tell me and Xu if it worked or not. He was like, I'll tell you guys at lab meeting, because he was like, he wanted to keep us in suspense. And then when he showed the data in lab meeting, that he was like, yeah, it worked. And actually, like, I can do this amnesia stuff now. I really think that's when Xu and I had the breath of fresh air, but also like a bit more of the euphoria of like, okay, it wasn't that I sneezed that day, or deodorant that you're wearing, or something random that could go wrong.
Yeah.
But someone else, it worked in someone else's hands. And that's, I think, when we both were like, okay, like, I think there's something real here. And then that's when kind of we internally accepted, I think, that this was really working.
Yeah. So it took some time to like set in actually.
More than a year, because like for the first,
Wow.
honestly, the first year was just very like, just kind of being excited about the coverage, but being worried about like, I had my own definition and ideas of engram. Xu had his own. Susumu definitely had his own. And I was like, at first, like a bit worried about, well, where am I being lumped into all of this? Because like, when can my thoughts kind of breathe on their own? And then also like being worried too about like, I don't know, when these things make a splash in the field, you get really like, you get megaphones for like the triumphs of science, and as well as all the reasons why this isn't why you think it is what you think it is, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it's like fighting a little bit of like a two-front war, where it was like, on the one hand, where like there's the field, and then there's the lab, and then there's like the criticism, but then on the other hand, there's like but it's still working and really exciting. So we're just trying to chip away at what it means and so on. So it was tumultuous, but like in a very like learning a lot from just the high octane experience, like from the high octane nature of it.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Like you can't just like steadily do your work without people caring about it, right? You just try to make a statement like that you implanted a false memory. People are like, wait, what? And they come out of the woodwork to tell you all the ways it's wrong. Or
I can't tell you how many emails we got that were like, hey, we read your paper, congrats, blah, blah, blah. By the way, here's why it's not a false memory. Or like, hey, we read your paper on reactivating engrams. It's like really cutting edge, blah, blah, blah. By the way, here's why it's not a memory. And I'm like, this is like, it's like academic explaining, where I'm just like, well, no one is real. Well, at least had I been comfortable enough in my own skin at that time as like a human being, I think I would have been more like vociferous about it. But like inwardly, I was just like, at least me, like I won't speak for Susumu or anyone else, but I was like, I think that we are at the tip of the iceberg of what an engram is, but it's certainly not even close to the entire picture. And it's certainly not an entire engram, because we don't really even know what an engram is. But it's still the tip of an iceberg. Like it's still something. It's still like, it's a repeatable, reproducible behavior that can go from negative memories to false memories to positive memories to all the gazillion and one instances where it's been used now. And I just like, I didn't mind like approaching it with a little bit of humble pie, just being like, we don't know exactly what the inner workings of this is. We just know that it does work. We're trying to figure out the nature of why it works. And I don't know, like I'm very comfortable having even the word engram have a provisional definition that we update with every paper that comes out. And I noticed that was a little bit at odds with like the predominant like lab culture at the time, which was like, if Susumu says it's an engram, it's an engram. And I'm like, well, I don't think that that's the way science works. Like, it's like, I hadn't yet, I guess, carved out my own views and identity in science to be able to have my own 2 cents of what I thought was going on. So it was interesting in that sense, living under the shadow of like the lab and the PI in grad school, until over time you kind of like carve out your own viewpoints and your own opinions and the works. So that definitely made it a little bit more, it was intellectually stimulating, but challenging at the same time.
Yeah, totally. So people's main beef with the paper was like about defining an engram, and that's what it meant, or were people pointing out other things? Yeah.
It's amazing the like semantic linguistic gymnastics people would play, where they would be like, it's not a false memory, it's second order conditioning in a context specific manner. And I'm like, that's just a false memory. Like when you have to caveat,
the whole thing is conditioning at the end of the day. It's all conditioning.
It's like when people are like, yeah, you did this like second order conditioning where this CS happened to be blah blah with the US and this, and then it's a context specific whatever. And then I'm just like, I think that is just a jargony way of saying false memory. And then I think a lot about like when in the 90s, when it was not as common for scientists to go on talk shows, you would get scientists that would go on talk shows, and the community would be like, how dare Carl Sagan say that, or how dare they say blah blah. It's like they're not like it. But it was just an earnest attempt at trying to communicate without the jargon, and to try to communicate in a way that casts a wide umbrella, a wide net, but without like diluting the science. Like, it's still faithful to the science. It's just putting it in different words, and presumably not in the words, or like the title of the paper itself, was presumably, we did it using, we wanted to make the title using words that everyone for the most part could understand. Because like, if we were to write like something about, yeah, second order conditioning in a context specific whatever, it'd probably still be it'd be the exact same paper. But then the reach and visibility and implications, I think we would actually be shortchanging ourselves there. So it's an interesting balance beam to walk, but because you don't want to like over sensationalize either, because that happens a lot as well. So that was the balance beam of like sensationalism, or like boring to the point of being unreadable. And then we want it to be, I think somewhere in the middle, there's just reality. And that's where we were trying to at least walk that balance beam.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, I super appreciate, like, yeah, the title is super clear. Anybody, like students, can understand it too. The abstract starts with like, memories are unreliable, and it's like immediately a thing that people care about and, you know, sort of can understand as a concept. And I think that's really, really cool. I'm sort of curious, like, as you, like, have you ever taught this paper to students, and like, you know, what's tough for people to understand, maybe like even technically, in the paper?
Yeah. The tough part is, or okay, everyone loves and gets figure 2. Everyone hates and has a hard time with figure 3. So like, so essentially the idea of like activating a neutral memory while an animal's being fear conditioned, and then the animals freeze to the neutral memory, that one's pretty like straightforward and explainable. And like it happened to coincide when I was like getting over my fear of public speaking, and I took like a bunch of just like speaking workshops and just like everything under the sun to try to get rid of the anxiety. But it gave me a new language to be able to really communicate in an intelligible manner. So hence the title. And then for figure 2, like the idea of this ABA design, like it was pretty straightforward to explain. And I think everyone, for the most part, finds it like digestible. The parts that are hard now are when we are like in figure 3, the parts that are hard are activating a false memory. So like first, like if we activate a neutral memory, the animals don't freeze. If that neutral memory has been associated with the foot shock so that it becomes a false memory, then those cells, the same cells that were neutral that are now false memory cells, now drive freezing. So that one's a little bit tougher for people to see, that the cells that were a contextual neutral memory were updated with the foot shock, like by activating the memory, blah, blah, blah. And that those cells are now functional to drive freezing. So that's step 1 that I think is a little bit of a more difficult pill to swallow, that like, wait a minute, like these cells that were once neutral now drive freezing, as opposed to just like, it's more intuitive to think that the animal's freezing somewhere that nothing bad happened. Like that one, I think, is just a bit more psychologically accessible. That's one part. The hardest part is, I think, that those false memory cells that now, I'll just call them that, like those false memory cells that now drive freezing, there's the question of like, well, what about the actual fear conditioning environment where the neutral memory was reactivated while the animals were being fear conditioned? And yeah, the neutral memory turned into a false memory, but what happened to the fear conditioning itself? Like what happened in that environment, like where the animal was fear conditioned while the neutral memory was being updated? This is where it gets a little tricky. And it's funny because like, it's not a coincidence that that's the part of the paper where like, this is consistent with these like Rescorla Wagner learning theory, blah, blah. And then it's like, well, that's where everyone goes to sleep, because no one like that's such a different, more in the weeds kind of interpretation, as opposed to the way I think about it is, when the animals are being fear conditioned, if they're just regularly fear conditioned and you give them a recall session, no manipulation, no nothing, they'll free, I don't know, they'll free 70%, let's say. If they're fear conditioned, but while we're reactivating the neutral memory to make the false memory, Then when the animals are put back in the fear context, they'll freeze like 40%. So like activating the contextual memory did interfere with the acquisition of the fear memory in that environment. So that's one, is this kind of interference effect. And then I think the hardest part of the paper, but one of like the maybe conceptually like coolest parts, is that when the animals are at 40% freezing, like they're in the fear conditioned environment, they're recalling it, but it's only at 40% because they had the neutral memory reactivated while they were there during conditioning, blah, 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 is that if they're freezing at 40% in the fear environment, but we reactivate the false memory cells, so they're already in the fear environment, but they're freezing at about 40%. If we reactivate the false memory cells, then that 40 goes up to like 60, or like it is additive, that like they're freezing and then reactivating a false fear memory on top of that freezing increases the freezing. Alternatively, if they're freezing and we reactivate a neutral memory, then they freeze less. So it's showing that the false fear memory can either add to the freezing in the environment where they were conditioned, or that a neutral memory can decrease freezing in the fear conditioned environment. But because that one has things going up and down and so on, it's a little bit more conceptually, I think, difficult to grasp, but it's cool because it's like, it's showing the interplay of like the natural expression of a memory and how that's interplaying with the artificial reactivation of a false fear memory to lead to more freezing, or a neutral memory to lead to less freezing.
Yeah, and I feel like it also points at how dynamic memory is. Like, it's not as if you just create a memory and then it exists and is never impacted, right? It feels like this experiment is very much about how you integrate new memories or new activity into the circuit.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, super cool. Is there anything else, like technically or conceptually, that you feel like is hard for folks as they work through the paper?
I think it's a little bit more intuitive for people to go through. I think it's also like at the tail end of figure 3 that like if you look at the brain of an animal recalling a false memory versus a natural real memory, that both engage the amygdala. So it's one of those, like, from the perspective of the brain, it is just a memory. From our perspective, we can say what's false and what's real. But the amygdala, in that sense, doesn't care. It didn't differentiate. It just, if the animal was recalling a fear memory, whether it's false or real, it engages the amygdala. Like that was at least like one cool bit of data that we thought, like, well, if it like quacks like a duck and walks like a duck, maybe it is, kind of thing. Maybe the other part is just with figure 4 is most people stop at like figure 2 because they're like, cool, I get it, false memory, great. With figure 4 is just that, like, you can do the exact same false memory experiment, but get animals to avoid the what they think is the negative environment in this like active place avoidance apparatus. So everything's the exact same, except the animals have a choice of escaping from the environment where they think they were shocked. And the fact that worked, though, was really exciting too, because it let us know that was our window into, can we do more than just freezing? And I wish more people in the field got to figure 4, because we always get this question even now where it's like, you know, there's all these engram studies about like fear and reactivating freezing and reactivating this in the hippocampus and amygdala and retrosplenial, blah, blah. But like, what about more active behaviors or more operant behaviors or more reward related behaviors? And I think now there's enough of a literature to really like convince even the most staunch naysayer that these activated engrams can drive like both appetitive and aversive behaviors. But the figure 4 was just, for me, particularly exciting because we were getting the animals to actively tell us that it was recalling something that it hadn't in fact experienced, rather than like, you know, there's a lot of reasons why the animals may default to freezing that may or may not have to do with memory per se, but getting the animals to actually avoid the environment where or the environment that we made into a false memory, getting them to actively like run away or avoid it, it at least like showed us the potency of this manipulation, that it could drive these more active behaviors. And I like was in love with that idea, because then it was like, okay, it's not just limited to freezing per se, but this now just opens up this opens up everything between complete immobility or escaping, and then like the world in between that the engram world is still trying to fill.
Yeah, totally. That makes a lot of sense. Like it's not just like a pure anxiety response or something. Like you can actually sort of measure decision making as a result of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. It's super cool. So like what has happened since this paper that you are most excited about, like that you feel like is like the coolest extension of it?
Yeah, I guess there's a couple of things where one really exciting part was like being able to take advantage of memory's malleability, and like we had a recent paper last year on um trying to reactivate positive memories while animals were recalling a negative memory to try to reconsolidate it and to try to like update the contents of that negative memory. And it worked really well, where it's like if we reactivate, in a sense, it was reactivating a positive memory to interfere with the negative memory. And it worked. And there was like ways of doing it so that it permanently mitigated fear responses. And like I was excited by that because like in humans, right, it's like there's we don't have to optically activate memories. Like you could just ask like, what did you do yesterday? And then bam, the memory comes back. So there's like a lot of ways of translating the idea without having to translate the technique, because like the technique almost doesn't really make sense to translate when we can get memory activation in people just linguistically and non-invasively in that sense. So like they'll do things in or there's like a bunch of groups now working, of course, with like with the sort of non-canonical drugs like MDMA, and having patients with living with PTSD recall a traumatic experience and have MDMA on board during the recollection of the experience to try to suppress some of the emotional components. The fact that it works in some people is like amazing, and we'd like to think that the positive memory reactivation in rodents is more of an analog of what may be happening in people with these non-invasive methods. And I'm really excited by that, because it's like if we show that positive memory reactivation is enough to interfere with the traumatic components of a negative experience, and we can mechanistically study it in rodents, then the question becomes like, not necessarily how do we do this in people, but can we take the idea of what we learned in rodents and apply that idea to people? And then whether it's with drugs like MDMA or whether it's with cognitive behavioral therapy or both in this case. So like that's one angle that I really like, and it really speaks to the ubiquity of memory, because it's like what we're artificially doing in rodents, we can non-invasively do in people. The second part is more of like really diving into like the idea that memory is not located in one XYZ point in the brain, but is this like three-dimensional distributed phenomena throughout the brain, probably throughout the brain body, and like really being able to study that, to try to study memory holistically. And like I think what's going to happen, this is just like maybe my hot take predicting into like 20 years, is that our tools have been amazing. Like you can zoom into the synapse, right? And then it's like, okay, we're zoom into the synapse, and you can zoom out to the cell, and then zoom out to populations of cells, to circuits, to systems, to behavior, blah, blah. And with engram in particular, like we find these hippocampus cells, and then a bunch of groups go in and, do everything from sequencing all the way to stimulating them and so on. And then we've appreciated for a while that, okay, there's more to memory than just the hippocampus. It's, again, this web of activity throughout the brain. So let's go from hippocampus to amygdala, to cortex, to thalamus, to all these areas. And then slowly a picture emerges of the three-dimensional nature of memory, and that the sights and sounds and smells and context of a memory are going to recruit the different parts of the brain that are involved in processing the sights and sounds and smells and emotions and context and so on. But then if we're figuring out ways of studying the brain-wide correlates of memories, but then, we're going to zoom out to the brain to then like bidirectional brain body feedback that's happening all the time, since the brain and the body never evolved independent of each other. And I think that what we're going to end up doing is zooming back out and actually looking at the organism holistically, and within the context, and like in people, let's say that like it's like a person doesn't make sense unless like in light of their brain and their like socioeconomic cultural surroundings. Like we need nature and nurture simultaneously. And I think that we're going to end up zooming back out, being like, oh, right, we got to look at the mouse or the person. We can zoom into the brain cells, but we can zoom out to the individual, to then the individual among this particular environment or this particular A or B. And like that holistic approach, I think, is something that has always been important. And I think that we're just going to end up rediscovering how important it really is as we start making our way up from genes to behavior to groups and cultures and things like that.
Wow, that's super cool. Yeah. I love the extension, especially to body stuff, because I just feel like, you know, you do have so much memory in your body, and the feedback from your body is so important. Like, absolutely. I also, so I've been like thinking a lot about EMDR recently, and I wonder like if you think that, I don't know, like the way EMDR works is because you're experiencing a memory in a different context or something. Like, I don't know. Do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah. So I think it's like pretty amazing. And I do think that there is a lot to how memory plays a role here. And like, you know, I almost imagine that that like, even though memory is something that we have or come equipped with for the most part, that like there we can conceptually look at it like a kind of drug, the way that like, or let's say memory manipulation, we can look at like a kind of drug where, or a kind of, drug or antidote even, where like, you know, repeated negative thinking can lead to brain body wide deterioration. And then like a kind of more optimism bias, or like the cup is half full approach, or like a bit more of mindfulness or positive thinking, or things that thankfully now are getting a lot more limelight scientifically to really understand it. And it's because it used to be a little bit more fluffy pop sci, but now it's like like gratitude journaling, for instance, it can be as potent as planning vacations, as exercising, as social enrichment. Like there are things that tap into our cognitive reservoirs of, let's say, positive memories that have very real biological effects. And like there's like a handful of studies looking at when you recall a positive autobiographical memory, you're like your heart rate goes back to baseline faster, your blood cortisol levels go back down to a baseline faster, you have a slightly more you're slightly more cognitively flexible during that meantime, whereas negative memories tend to just do the opposite with all three. And like, and I think that's so profound, because it means that if we make a concerted effort at, like, I'm going to oversimplify it, but like if we make a concerted effort of like, all right, like I am going to gratitude journal 4 days a week, but I'm also going to work out 4 days a week, and I'm going to I don't know, call my friends a couple of times a week, or just something like the only silver bullets that we have against literally any like whether it's cardiovascular disease or the dementias or everything in between. It's like if we can do that, then like prevention becomes the cure, but it becomes a really potent one, because one of those preventatives involve accessing our memories, and then using our memories as a kind of antidote, where it's like, okay, if I think about the things that make me happy, maybe it can protect me a little bit, even if it's a few percentage points. It's not nothing. And I think like music does this to us all the time. With like, it's cool because like when I think about this with EMDR, I think about this in the context of like, we have, let's say you have EMDR music and I don't know, like ice baths or something, just something that may work it with like in some way, that if they're tapping into memory, then it means that like memory is the thing that we're trying to, like, it's the muscle that we're trying to leverage here. And we can get at that memory through EMDR, or through our favorite song, or like, I don't know, like I was listening to like the Spotify Wrapped, right? And just like listening to the top 10 songs I've heard all year. Every single one of them, I'm like, not only do they have particular moods and memories linked with them, but they all end with me being like, I can't wait to listen to the next one, or I can't wait for the next song. So like, there's a lot of powerful inroads to memory that we have already. And I think that like these techniques now are just helping us triangulate which work best for us. Like maybe what works best for me with music might work best for someone else with MDMA, might work best for someone else with like running while thinking about something. Like I think we all have our own cocktail that would work. but figuring out that cocktail is like, I don't know, this is probably like there's like some company that will make an app at some point that probably taps into this.
Yeah.
But I think it speaks to like how potent these kinds of memories can be. So it's a long-winded way of saying like, yeah, I think that there is like an intimate relationship between that and memory, and a pretty powerful one at that.
Yeah, that's so cool. I love the idea of memory as like a muscle, like a preventative muscle. That's like,
Yeah.
I wouldn't have thought about like the false memory or like the memory updating work in that kind of context, but it makes total sense. Yeah. No, that's really, really cool.
Yeah. And I mean, when you think about it, right, it's like if I think about, oh, here, actually, just to give one quick example, when I was getting over my fear of public speaking, what I would do before having to give a talk was, I would watch reruns of like different plays that the Patriots did to win whatever Super Bowl, because I was just like born and bred in Boston and just like love all things Boston sports, blah, blah, blah. But like I would watch them and I would be like, I'd get really excited. I would kind of like time travel back to when I was watching the game and whatever comeback is happening. But like it would really work because I would get really jazzed and I'd just be very like excited that I'm watching something that at some point brought me joy. And memory can be that. I can think about something that at some point brought me joy or brings me joy. And it's got to be very concerted though. Like I have to be super intentional about thinking about an autobiographical memory in and out. But when I am, it can either put me in a borderline euphoric mood, or like a song, if you or a memory can bring you to tears too. So like the fact that like a memory can change your biology in a few seconds to either be like, I feel like I am on MDMA, or I need to let out a good cry because I'm thinking about something like very near and dear. A memory can do that. So I think that like the fact that it can do that really, I think like underscores a million times how powerful it is to have. And yet, yeah. And I think that like, you know, it's not like one of those, we need to tap into 100% of our memories limitless kind of thing. But I do think it is like a little bit of a underappreciated like potency that can exist in memory in particular.
Yeah, that's super cool. I'm probably gonna hit you up for another conversation about this because I've been thinking kind of along this lines around like a project, maybe a book that's something about like, you know, mind over matter, like the ways that we can change our chemistry and,
Yeah.
you know, in a way that like isn't, you know, obviously you can find like a ton of self-help books or whatever that are just like sort of floofy and not based in science, right?
Yeah.
But I think you're totally right. It's like there's actually like very cool science underlying a lot of this stuff now. And like I was talking to Kara Marshall, who's at
Oh yeah.
Baylor, and like she does all this research on, you know, like pressure receptors in your gut and stuff. And there's like people that can like feel that or not, and like, you know, like how much conscious control do you have over like your gut even, or you know, your mood, as you said. And like these are powerful things, they impact our immune system and all this stuff. And I think you're totally right. Yeah.
I mean, maybe the most like prevalent example of this that we don't think about, or I don't think about as often, is like when we're dreaming. Like when you're dreaming, everything in that moment is real to you, right? It's like the rock is going to hit you, or you're flying for whatever reason, or you're scared that something's following you. Like every one of those feel as real gets. And of course we're just dreaming, it's just in our head. But I think it's like, well, everything is just in our head. And I think that like that it's a really I think it's a really like relatable example of, yeah, like the mind over matter part. It's like, well, we can do mind over matter so much that we live in, it's like the show Severance, where like when we go to bed, that's our other half of life that we're experiencing. And yet it's like a really, in those dream moments, it's real. Like it's real. It feels real. It maybe looks wonky and it doesn't feel like reality. But like from our perspective, we just kind of created this whole other world that we're going through, along with associated like emotions and sights and sounds and smells. So like, if our brain can do that, I think it can do a lot. Like clearly, if it can just construct these worlds where we're half dead in sleep.
Totally. Yeah, totally. Oh, that's super cool. I want to be mindful of your time.
Oh, yeah,
So
no
I
worries.
know we're like almost up on an hour. I guess, is there like anything else you feel like you didn't get to say about the paper, or I don't know, anything else you want to share about it?
Yeah. Okay, so with false memories in particular, oh yeah, that one of the things, it gives me less less of an existential crisis now, but like if there's like this idea that I forget what I think the saying is like, you know, you can't step in the same river twice. And like one thing is that with memory, one thing at least that we've learned in the past few decades is like that it's not like an iPhone video of the past, but is like it's reconstructive. And when we recall a memory, where like it's like we're taking the book out of the library, but we're scribbling in it every single time, or like hitting save as on a Word document. Or I think of it as like when you recall a memory, you're applying new Instagram filters to it unknowingly, so that even though it's gonna look like the original thing that you took a picture of, but it's not the exact same.
Mm.
So and I think that that's true every single time we recall a memory, that like we can never recall the same exact memory twice. And that's kind of, I think that the implications of that are pretty deep, because like, I don't know, I think of memory as the thing that threads our sense of being over time. But if memories are inherently unstable, and if their inner biology is definitely unstable, then what does that say about our sense of self over time? That like that, and you know, in a sense, I'm like, it's not that it doesn't matter, but it's kind of like it's like a rainbow, where it's like, well, it exists and it's there, but you can zoom in and break it down to its like component wavelengths and how the sun's refracting this and that, or you can zoom out and be like, oh, there's a rainbow. And I think that maybe with our sense of self, it's the same thing, where like memories thread our sense of self over time. And when we look at it over time, we see the rainbow. But if we really dig in deep, we're like, oh, damn, this is not as rainbowy as we thought. Like there's actually a lot of like, we're constantly updating memories. We're constantly updating our sense of self. I definitely feel like a different person today than I did 5 years ago, let alone 25 years ago. And yet memories persist, even though like there has been turnover over every cell in my body multiple times over. So I think that that's like, that's one angle here, is like, what are the implications of having malleable memories? And if memories are the things that thread our sense of being over time, how malleable is our sense of being? Because that feels pretty rigid, but maybe that's a little bit of an illusion in a not bad way, like illusion in this, not in the sense of being fake, just illusion in the sense of like, nature's tricky. And I think that the second part, and maybe the one that I think can be very class friendly too, is like, if you look, you put someone under a scanner, they're recalling a memory, hippocampus lights up. When forming or recalling certain false memories, you'll also get the hippocampus light up. So the first question is like, why would the area of the brain that enables memory also enable its updating, or its malleability in a sense? Then the kind of curveball is like, well, if we imagine ourselves in some future scenario, that the act of imagination also begins to recruit areas like the hippocampus. So it's like, I think that like areas like the hippocampus are kind of, maybe this is just true of the brain, but like past, present, and future just kind of converge in areas like the hippocampus. And that maybe the purpose of having memory is to like, ironically, to stay ahead of the present, to like be able to use the past to make predictions about the future. And like, that memory is what enables our future, ironically enough. But then the false memories, that it so happens, and this is just a total guess, that if we have the biology that enables memory, and that biology also enables imagination, those areas like the hippocampus are what are super active when you're dreaming. So it's like, if you get areas, and I get that there can be a little bit of a fallacy here, like these don't necessarily have to be related just because the brain area is active for all of them. But like, if areas like the hippocampus are active when we're making memories, when we're imagining ourselves in the future, and even when we're dreaming, then maybe having susceptible memories is a feature and not a bug. It's a feature so that we can constantly update and make predictions about an uncertain future. That like when we're dreaming, for instance, or imagining things, we usually imagine things with memory as a backdrop that we don't even realize exists as a backdrop. Like it's really hard to imagine something bona fide experienceless. Like there's always some wall that we've seen before, a sound that we've heard before, a people that we see or know of, or things like that. So it's like, it could be that having the kinds of memories that or having the biological capacity for memory that we have, and having the biological capacity for imagination that we have, and for dreaming that we have, that false memories are they're the leftover, they're the side effect. That it's like false memories are the price we pay for having otherwise remarkable and updatable and flexible memories that help us imagine and dream and things like that too. And false memories just kind of piggybacked along for the ride as this inevitable side effect that exists here. Yeah, is one, I guess, like theory that false memories are the price we pay for otherwise having pretty remarkable machinery that enables this two-way travel to the past and to the future kind of thing.
Yeah, that's really cool. That's a very glass 3/4 full way to see it. Amazing. Awesome. Thank you so much for doing this. It was super fun to chat and to hear about this, and hear all the stories related to the paper and all your thoughts.
No, I really appreciate it. And like, definitely, like if there's any either like follow up or anything that's like not clear that I can help out with, count me in. But then also like even other any other projects that you may have, or like anything at all that I can help out with, like it gives me an excuse to not be like grant writing and glued to my computer and actually doing fun things that I enjoy. So yeah, count me like 1,000,000,000% in. I think it'd be super fun to continue just like working on things or these kinds of things together for sure.
Yeah, totally. Same to you. Anytime things come up. And yeah, I'll definitely send you a draft just like for some fact checking, make sure things are good. And yeah, if there's anything that's like unclear, I'll reach out. But yeah, this is super fun, Steve.
Hey, yeah, this was awesome. I hopefully we like if we're ever in each other's neck of the woods and stuff, it'd be awesome to catch up in person at some point.
For sure. For sure.
And until then, like, yeah, I'm Zoom friendly literally anytime. And like, yeah, really look forward to like just catching up on all things like science and life and class and everything in between.
Yeah, for sure. All right, cool. Good to see you, Steve.
Yeah, good to see you too. Happy Friday.
The Transmitter.